Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels, and today I'm kicking off a two-part mixed media card making series. In part one, I'm walking you through how I build layered backgrounds using stencils, stamps, ink, sprays, and paste. If you've ever wondered what order to layer your mixed media techniques so you don't end up with a muddy mess, this tutorial is for you. I'll share my approach for planning your layers, understanding which mediums to use when, and why the order matters. This is how I like to do it to get beautiful results, and I hope it helps you feel more confident experimenting with your own supplies. So first off, I'm going to go over the supplies that I'm going to be working with on this card, and just to start off with, first thing, you do not need to use the exact same stamp stencils or mediums that I'm using. I really highly encourage you just to shop your stash for something similar, because more than likely you've got something that you can use. The stamp set that I'm working with on the background is the Creative Combos stamp set by 49 Market and Sizzix, and I'll be using this grid and text type image here for the background. Now this stamp set also comes with the coordinating dies, but I'm not going to be using any of that here for the background. So as far as any kind of stamps, I would just look for some like smaller detail type images like the two here I'm going to be using. And then I'm also going to be using the stencil that is called Petal Play, and it's by 49 Market and Sizzix as well. And I'll be using this kind of flourish type image down here, and then also this text script type image here. And you can use any kind of stencil you want from your stash, so just, feel free to grab a couple different stencils and play along. So now I'm going to go over the mediums I'm going to be working with to create the background. And because I'm going to be doing a variety of mixed media techniques, I'm going to be using a permanent waterproof ink to do some of the stamping. And the permanent waterproof ink is helpful if you don't want your stamped images to bleed or run or anything like that. We're going to be doing a variety of mixed media techniques, and the other inks I'm going to be working with are dye inks, and dye inks are typically water reactive, so when you add any other kind of ink to them or water to them, you will kind of reactivate that ink. And I've got several different colors here. I've got Mint Chill, Just Peachy, and Cappuccino, and these are by 49 Market and Ranger ink. But any kind of dye ink will work for the techniques that we're going to be doing with the ink pads. And then I've got a couple sprays here. This is the Distress Spritz in Cracked Pistachio and Tattered Rose. And this is just a shimmer spray that has like a mica in the bottom of it. So when you add this to your project, it adds just a little touch of shimmer and shine. If you don't have the spritz sprays, you could also work with any other kind of sprays. The only one I maybe wouldn't recommend as far as trying to replace these with is any sort of like mica stains, because those give you a really solid coverage, where these are just more of a light coverage spray. So you might want to just kind of keep that in mind when you're picking, if you don't have these, if you're going to be picking some other sprays to play with. I would go with light colors that coordinate with your ink choices. So like for here, I've got the Mint Chill and it's Just Peachy, and that's why I picked the Tattered Rose, because that's pretty close to that, and then the Cracked Pistachio because it's pretty close to that one. And then I'm also going to be working with some texture paste. And here I'm using the Lunar Paste Gold Rush. This is by Simon Hurley and Ranger ink, and any kind of texture paste will work. This just happens to have, this gold color to it, but you could pick any color you want, or you could just even use just regular texture paste as well. And then because we are going to be working with a variety of mediums and mixed media type techniques, including inks, sprays, paste, I really recommend some sort of watercolor cardstock or mixed media paper that can handle all of these different types of mediums. I personally will be using Distress watercolor cardstock because that just happens to be my favorite one to work with. And for a lot of my projects, I just like to always start with this paper because then it gives me the flexibility to add more layers as I'm progressing along and deciding what I'm going to be doing. I can know that this paper is going to be able to handle anything I put on it. So let's get into it. So when it comes to doing mixed media layers on your card, you really need to start off with thinking about what kind of supplies you want to work with and what kind of mediums you want to work with. You do need to do a little bit of planning, mostly just so that you don't end up with a muddy mess. One of the things that I find that always helps me when I'm going to do mixed media is making sure I just start off with paper that can handle whatever kind of medium I want to work with. So for me, that's distressed watercolor cardstock, but there's other types of mixed media papers and watercolor papers out there that can handle a lot of wet mediums. So if you have, whatever brand or kind that you like, pull that out to use. And then from there, it's a matter of thinking about, do you want to use stamps? Do you want to use stencils? Do you want to use inks? Do you want to use spray inks? Do you want to use some kind of a paste? So thinking about all of those things when it comes to doing mixed media will help you kind of make your plan. And then from there, it's also kind of important to know a little bit about the type of mediums that you're working with. So if you're working with water reactive inks, then you've got inks that if you get them wet again, whether it's with another ink, spray, or water, those inks are going to get reactivated. That can mean that they could run a little bit and move, so they're not going to stay permanent. So that could, that's also the case with some sprays. So you just need to keep that in mind. If they're water-based, they're going to react with other water-based mediums. So if you're working with inks that have a pigment in them, such as like the distress oxide inks or any type of other kind of pigment ink out there like VersaFine Clair inks, and there's lots of different brands. Those inks are going to be a little more permanent. Now the oxides are kind of a little separate because they are still water reactive, but they're a hybrid ink. So if they're a true pigment ink, they're going to be a little more permanent once they dry. And then of course there's also like the archival inks that are like an oil-based ink that are permanent and waterproof. And that is kind of my choice to work with using either a pigment ink or a permanent ink when I'm doing mixed media, especially when I'm going to do any kind of stamping, because then I know that those stamped images aren't going to run or get muddy or messed up. That said, if you want that look, then you don't need to use a permanent ink. You can use just a regular dye ink to do your stamping with. But it's not going to give you quite the same crispness depending on the type of ink pad that it is. So like these are linen based. The foam based ink pads are going to give you a little bit more of a crisp stamped image. The linen pads are going to be less crisp, but you can still stamp with them. But again, lots of things to think about. So as we're going through making this background for this card, I'm going to kind of talk about creating those layers and like the thought process of why I'm picking what ink and medium to do on each layer. So for this card, I know I want to do something with some stamps, and I know I want to work with my stencil. And so with that said, I know with the stamps, I'm probably going to lean towards using some sort of more permanent type ink, as I mentioned. So either the pigment ink or the archival ink. But before we get into any of the stamping, I'm going to add some ink, stencil work, and techniques to the background. Now, again, I'm working on the distressed watercolor cardstock, and I've got a stencil here. This is just the Petal Play stencil. And again, any stencil will work. And I'm going to take a dye ink pad. This is just Peachy from 49 and Market. And I am going to think about this, but I'm gonna do like a monoprint transfer type technique. So I'm gonna be putting this design onto that paper. So to do that, I'm just going to apply this ink pad to my stencil and just kind of stamp it around to transfer that ink onto the paper. You could also do this with the spray ink if you wanted to just spray the stencil to get the ink transferred on there. But I'm just going to use this ink pad here and just kind of keep tapping, tapping, tapping until I get inks transferred over onto the stencil. Because you want a good amount of coverage so that the whole largest part of the stencil is covered, so you can use it to cover the area on the paper that you're working with. And then once you have that, you got some ink on your mat, you can clean that off. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to spray this with my spray bottle, and I'm just going to get this ink pretty wet. I want it to be wet, so almost turning it as if it was going to had been sprayed on here. So if you sprayed ink on here, you don't need to add the extra water. You could add maybe just a tiny little bit, but you probably won't need as much. And then I'm going to flip that stencil over and lay that down onto my paper. And then from there, I'm just going to take another clean paper towel and just kind of rub that over the top. And when I rub it over the top, I'm holding the paper and the stencil still so the stencil doesn't shift on me. And then that's just going to help me dab up any excess ink that might soak up through the openings on the stencil. But then I also kind of like to go around and kind of tap the paper down where there is ink so that I can transfer that over onto my background. Another option you could do, just carefully holding everything down after you've tapped off the excess, is you could just take a little brayer and roll that over the surface just to give it a good even amount of pressure. And then from there, you're just going to gently peel that up, and then you've got your transferred image there. So I'll clean up this excess ink here, and then from there you can just set that stencil to the side and or clean it off. The next step I like to do before I add another layer is just to dry in between. And by drying, these colors, when you're working with a dye ink, those colors, when you layer another color on it, they're going to tend to want to layer and build a little bit. Whereas if you add it on while the ink is wet, then they're going to blend. And sometimes you want that depending on what kind of colors you're working with. And sometimes I just, like for this one, because I'm going to be working with a very different color, I'm going to be working with this kind of green color, I kind of want them to build with each other instead of blend. So this could be where you decide that's good for me and I want to stop with layers. And you could skip this next step and go on to the next step past this if you wanted. So any of these can be mixed and matched. You could do this next technique, which is just some ink smooshing. You could do this first. I just chose to do the stencil technique first because I wanted more peach on my background than I wanted the mint chill, which is the color I've got here. So it's just a real light peach, or real light mint color. I'm going to spritz that with a little water there. And now I'm going to just tap just little sections of this into the paper. I'm not going to smush the whole thing down. I'm just going to tap little sections. So I'm going to take this corner, for example, and just tap it there into that. And then just kind of rotating around and just tapping small sections into the ink that's on my craft mat. And let's maybe try one here in the center. Tap down and tap down. So I'm not pushing super hard The lighter you tap in, the less ink you're gonna pick up. And then from there again, just kind of clean up that excess ink. And I just wanted this subtle bit of color added. So I'm gonna dry this now. And that's like I was saying, planning this out, I wanted more of that peach color to show in the stencil. So that's why I did that layer first. But you could ink smush first. And if you're careful, just doing light amounts to start with, you could switch the order of these. But there's no right or wrong either. So like if you want to do it one way and then the other, you can't really mess anything up here. So, I mean, also, like, that's the biggest thing I think, is just to encourage you to play and try and see what happens. You know, make a panel like I just did, but then do the opposite of what I just did and see what actually happens. Like, how does it look different, and maybe you like it better, you know? So here we are. We've done our kind of watercolory techniques with the dye ink. So this is the ink that's water reactive. And now we can do, for the next layer, we can do some stamping. And you could do the stamping first. However, sometimes I do find that some inks, especially these lighter colors like light browns and light grays, I don't know why, but they do seem to kind of bleed just slightly when I stamp first and then do the ink techniques that I just did. So for this, I'm going to do the stamping after I've created the ink smushed background. A lot of times I do my stamping first. If I'm just working with like a dark color like black especially, or a super dark brown, the lighter colors I find to be just different. I think it just comes to the chemistry of things, and I don't quite understand it to that level. So now I've got a couple stamps here. I've got this little script stamp or text stamp and this grid stamp that are from the Creative Combo stamp set from 49 Market. Any stamp sets will work for this. Just some sort of smaller, kind of little like detailed type stamps are kind of fun for this next layer. And as I mentioned, if you're like, I'm also going to be doing some paste work on this background. And typically you want to do your paste last. So that's also kind of something to keep in mind if you think about trying, putting paste down and you've got then that texture. It's hard to stamp over that sometimes. So it's not that you can't do it, but it's just not as easy to do. So now we're gonna take that waterproof ink, and I'm gonna start off with just applying some of that ink to this text image. And I'm gonna be using my fingers to stamp this just kind of randomly here and there on the background. Now there's lots of different ways to do this. I don't want full, I don't want to stamp this full image on there. I just want like little bits and pieces of it. So if you just tap it down here and there, you're gonna get little bits and pieces. Just barely touch it down. You can always go back in and add a little bit more. And then you can just add some more ink. This is just adding a little bit of texture and interest to that background. And I've seen people where they kind of do this rocky motion. I don't find that to work for me as good. I kind of prefer to just take sections of it, kind of push those down onto the paper. If you need to add more, you can always go back and add a little more. And then I'm going to do that same thing with this little grid stamp. Just add another little bit of texture and interest. You would not need to do both of these. You can just do one or the other. But just kind of like the combination of them together. you can kind of just keep going until you run out of ink on the stamp. But even if you keep going and there's just a little bit of ink, you kind of get in that second generation stamping where it just gives you just a little, you know, what's left on the stamp. Kind of fill in any extra areas, but then it's not super dark. So that's always a nice option as well. So here we are. So now we've got 3 layers of techniques on here. So we have the stencil, print, we have the ink smooshing, and now we have some stamping. Next, the final layer we're going to do is some of that stencil work, and I mentioned working with paste. You can work with any kind of paste. I thought it would be fun to work with this lunar paste in Gold Rush just to add a little shimmer, but you could work with any kind of texture paste here. It just adds a nice little bit of texture and interest to things without getting super bulky. All right, so now we're just going to take some of that paste and put it onto the back of the palette knife and then just scrape that through the stencil. And then you can just carefully lift that up. Here we are. And then I'm going to clean that off. And then I'm going to do a little bit more stencil work down here across this bottom part. So we'll just grab a little more paste and apply that through the stencil. And I'm just kind of using my fingers to hold up so it doesn't fall down into that area that we just did the paste on. If you're worried about messing that up, you can always just set this to the side and let it dry and then come back and do this other corner. But when you're applying the paste, you just want to make sure that you're not putting so much on that it's so thick that you can't see through the stencil. That means you probably got a little bit more on there than you need. And I'm just going to peel that up. And then I'm going to set this to the side to dry. If you got some paste on an area that you don't want it, unfortunately with this gold metallic paste, it's a little bit more of a challenge to scrape off and get off of there if you don't like where it is, but we can always add some splatters and stuff like that to kind of hide any messes. So we'll talk about that later too as well. So I am going to get my mat cleaned off here and my palette knife and my stencil, and because you don't want to let that paste dry on there, and then we'll just, like I said, set this to the side and let it dry. So now here is a look at where we are with the background. So now we've got 4 layers. Now you could stop again at this point if you like. However, I thought it would be fun to add a little bit of some splatters. So I'm going to take this Tatter Rose Distress Spritz, and this again is always a nice thing to do after you've done other things. So this is usually kind of one of the later layers or last layers. Now you could do this layer before the paste or after the paste, but you wouldn't want to do this first and then try to do the ink smooshing and the stencil work that we did. And the stamping, depending on the type of spray ink you're working with, like if you've got one like this where it's got the mica in it, and it's shimmery or pearlescent like, you can't always stamp super great on this. So I like to do this at the end as well. And so this is just a really light color, and you just want to make sure you shake it up really well if it does have that mica in the bottom of it, so that none of it's showing up there on the bottom of the bottle when you turn it over. And then I'm just gonna hold this back pretty far, so it's kind of out of the camera though, and just give it a light spritz. Now, you're not gonna see much of anything in the camera, but in person, you're immediately gonna get a lot of shimmer and shine. And like I said, I don't think you're gonna be able to see it on the camera. Oh, there we go, if I get close enough. Just see that little touch of shimmer it creates. And then when you're done with that, just wipe off the nozzle. And you can also use your sprays to add splatters if you like. So that's what I'm gonna do here with this cracked pistachio. Again, shake it up really good. The other thing about the shaking it does is it will really minimize clogging. So if you shake these up really well, you really shouldn't get much in the way of clogging happening. The clogging really happens when that mica gets stuck in the little straw that's in there. And then before I add these splatters, I'm just gonna give this a quick little dry, just to make sure. I just don't want the colors to blend. I want them to kind of stay separate. So again, like as I mentioned earlier, when you're dealing with anything that's water-based, when you dry it in between, you're gonna get more of a blending or a buildup and layers instead of blending. So if it's wet, it will blend. So we're gonna just get a little bit of that ink onto the end of the nozzle here. And I'm just gonna tap that, create a few little splatters here and there over the background. And then I'm gonna give that a little dry. Now the splatters will take a little bit longer to dry. So you can set this to the side or you can use your heat tool, just kind of keep that heat tool moving. Don't hold it in one place for too long so you don't melt that paste. Just kind of keep it moving here until all the little droplets are dry. Shouldn't take very long. But if it is taking longer and some of that mica is wiping off in your fingers, it just means the ink's not dry and you just need to give it a little bit more time. But so here we are with our final layer on the background. So I'm just going to kind of show you that little shimmer from the addition of those splatters. So there we are. So now we've got 5 layers on a background, and that you could do any single one of those or combination of those just by going in kind of the right order. So like if you wanted to just do the ink smooshing and the stencil work, do the stencil work second. So just kind of think about that order that we did things in, and you should be good to go. So the last thing I've decided I'm going to come back and do on this background is I'm going to add some inking around the edges like I did on my little tag there. So just got a little blending brush here and more of that light brown ink. And I'm just starting off my mat, kind of holding that brush at a little bit of an angle here, and then just working around that edge in a little bit of a circular motion to kind of pull that ink onto the edge of my paper. And then just continue that all the way around. And you can also kind of rub it around the edges as well. I'm going to get a little, I like to do that because it gets rid of the white edge, which I don't know why, but that's always something that I don't care for. And then if you wanted to do splatters on this too, like we did earlier with the water bottle, you can. Earlier we just splattered with the nozzle, but now I'm just going to actually pull the trigger and add some little splatters here and there. And I'm just kind of doing them around the edge where we added that ink. And then again, we can just give that a quick dry. Now, I didn't add very much of that brown ink, but I pulled more ink onto the edges, like more in towards the center. Then this layer here with the spray, with the water splatters, would add even more interest. So this is just going to be kind of subtle, but it's just one more little layer that you can add to create some interest and mixed media style to your card. So here down in this corner, you can kind of see what happened when we added those water splatters. It really shows up there pretty good. But there's a look at that finished background. I hope you enjoyed learning my approach for building mixed media backgrounds and understanding how to layer techniques without creating a muddy mess. Remember, this is just what works for me, and I encourage you to experiment with your own supplies and see what order gives you the results you love. Now this is part 1 of a 2-part series. In part 2, I'll take you step by step through creating the embellishments, plus I'll share my best tips for assembling the layers and adding dimension to complete the card. So be sure to watch out for that next video. You can find links to all of the products I used in the description box below, along with a visual supply list for quick reference. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more creative ideas. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these background layers are you most excited to try? Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.